Federal gun policy just cracked wide open, and almost nobody is talking about what actually happened on April 29, 2026, in one single day. The agency that polices every gun store, every manufacturer, and every firearm transfer in America signed off on 34 separate regulatory changes. Not one, not five, 34. Industry lawyers are calling it the most sweeping firearms regulatory overhaul in the history of the ATF. And if that claim is even half true, it should be front-page news in every city in this country. It is not. So we're going to do what the algorithm-chasing outlets won't do. We're going to slow down, open the actual documents, and tell you exactly what changed, who benefits, who gets hurt, and why this is happening. In the same year, several states are racing in the complete opposite direction. Before we get into it, if you want journalism that explains instead of screams, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and check the link in the description, because this story does not end with this video. It is just getting started. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand who just moved. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives is the federal agency that writes and enforces the rulebook. Every licensed gun dealer in America operates under. Every manufacturer, every importer, every collector of a regulated weapon answers to this agency in some form. When the ATF shifts its regulations, it is not a niche policy tweak for gun enthusiasts. It ripples from the factory floor all the way down to the counter of your neighborhood gun shop. On that Wednesday afternoon, newly confirmed ATF Director Robert Cicada stood at a Department of Justice podium, flanked by representatives from the National Rifle Association, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, Gun Owners of America, and the Second Amendment Foundation, and called the package the most significant modernization of ATF regulations in the agency's history. That is an extraordinary claim for any government agency to make about itself. And extraordinary claims demand scrutiny, not applause. So instead of taking the podium's word for it, we went and looked at what is actually in this package, because the details matter far more than the press release ever will. The centerpiece of this shift did not begin on April 29th. It began weeks earlier, in March of 2026, when the ATF quietly terminated what was known as the Enhanced Regulatory Enforcement Policy. That was a Biden-era directive instructing ATF field divisions to pursue license revocation against federally licensed dealers for what the policy labeled willful violations. Things like paperwork errors on the mandatory transaction form, Form 4473, or discrepancies in a dealer's record-keeping book. The replacement, called the Administrative Action Policy, takes an entirely different posture. It tracks where firearms actually end up and what the real public safety outcomes are, while explicitly deprioritizing what the agency now calls immaterial paperwork errors. In plain English, a dealer who misspells a customer's street address is no longer treated the same way as a dealer who knowingly hands a gun to someone legally barred from owning one. Ask yourself, honestly, is that a reasonable recalibration toward what actually protects the public, or is it cracking open a door that lets careless or complicit dealers slide through under a friendlier label? That is a legitimate question, and it deserves a real answer, not a talking point, which is exactly why we are going to look at both sides before this video is over. The National Shooting Sports Foundation and dealer advocacy groups had lobbied hard against the old policy, arguing it was being weaponized to shut down otherwise law-abiding small businesses over trivial clerical mistakes that had nothing to do with keeping guns out of dangerous hands. From where the industry stands, this is a long overdue correction, one that lets a dealer who makes an honest typo keep the livelihood they built, instead of losing it over a paperwork technicality. Now let's get into the actual substance of these 34 proposals, because the ATF organized them into 5 distinct categories, and each one tells you something different about what is really changing on the ground. The first category is repeal, and it targets regulatory language the agency itself admits either exceeded its statutory authority, collapsed under judicial review, or simply failed to accomplish what it was built to do. The headline item here is the formal rescission of the 2023 rule that reclassified pistols equipped with stabilizing braces as short-barreled rifles, a classification that would have forced millions of those firearms to be registered under the National Firearms Act. That rule had already been gutted in the courts, blocked by the Fifth Circuit, and this proposal simply makes the rollback official at the regulatory level. Alongside it, the ATF is stripping the 2 sentences it added back in 2018 that redefined bump stocks as machine guns language. The Supreme Court had already functionally invalidated in Garland v. Cargill 2 years earlier. The second category, modernize, focuses on dragging decades-old requirements into the current century. That includes a full overhaul of Form 4473 itself, described by multiple industry trackers as the most significant rewrite to that form's process in years, covering how it is completed, stored, and processed electronically, plus a formal framework around electronic record-keeping that finally catches regulation up to where the industry already quietly moved years ago. The third category, reduce burden, is where some of the more eyebrow-raising individual changes live, and this is where you need to pay close attention. One proposal eliminates the requirement to get advance notice or approval before traveling across state lines with a lawfully registered NFA firearm for trips lasting up to a year. That means someone traveling with a registered short-barreled rifle no longer has to file a form and sit around waiting for federal approval before the trip, as long as it wraps within 12 months. Another proposal lets married couples jointly register and possess NFA firearms without setting up a legal trust first, and treats transfers between spouses under that joint registration as something other than a formal, separately taxed transfer. A third eliminates the requirement to forward copies of NFA applications to local chief law enforcement officers, a step gun rights advocates had criticized for years as redundant theater. Since local law enforcement notification never actually granted or denied anything, it was informational only. The fourth category, clarify, tackles areas of firearms law that have genuinely confused ordinary gun owners for years. The most consequential piece here clarifies federal preemption protections for gun owners simply passing through states with stricter laws than their home state, treating an overnight hotel stay, a stop for gas, a medical emergency, as legitimately protected activity during transport. If you've ever wondered what happens to a lawful gun owner who just needs to refuel while driving to a state with much tougher restrictions, this is the ATF trying to draw a cleaner line around exactly that scenario. And the fifth category, align, brings import, export, and transfer rules in line with current statutory authority and existing business practice, including new procedures for firearms activity inside foreign trade zones and customs bonded warehouses. Now, layer on top of all of this something that already took effect months before this announcement, because this is where the real financial story lives. As of January 1st, 2026, the $200 federal tax stamp, the fee required for decades on every transfer or manufacturing application involving items regulated under the National Firearms Act, suppressors, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and the catch-all category, known as any other weapons, was eliminated entirely for those categories. That change came out of broader federal legislation passed in 2025. Machine guns and destructive devices, notably, were left out of that tax elimination and still carry the original fee and the full NFA registration burden, but for suppressors specifically, which have seen a genuine surge in interest from hunters and shooters concerned about hearing protection, the removal of that $200 fee is being called by gun owner advocacy groups and one of the most significant practical wins for lawful owners in years. One industry tracker reported roughly 150,000 suppressor applications filed electronically on New Year's Day alone, an almost unbelievable single-day number that tells you exactly how much pent-up demand had been sitting behind that fee for decades. But here is where I need you to slow down and actually listen, because this is the detail that gets buried every single time this story gets told. Registration and background check requirements did not disappear alongside that tax. Anyone acquiring one of these items still has to file the appropriate ATF form, submit fingerprints and a photograph, and pass the exact same background check process that existed before. What changed is specifically the financial cost, and in several of these 34 proposals, some of the procedural friction around ownership, travel, and transfer. That distinction matters enormously, and it is exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened the moment a headline reduces this to major gun law changed. If you're finding this breakdown useful, if this is the kind of reporting you wish more channels actually did, instead of screaming a headline and moving on, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button, tap the bell for notifications, and drop a comment telling me which of these 34 changes actually surprised you. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are sick of getting fed outrage instead of facts. Now let's talk about why this is happening in 2026 specifically, because timing here is not an accident. The administration has framed the entire effort as a long overdue course correction, tracing it back to a directive from President Trump ordering the Department of Justice to review the ATF's enforcement record for what officials characterized as gun rights violations under the prior administration. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche personally signed the package at that April 29th press conference, the same afternoon, notably, that the Senate confirmed Robert Cicada as the new ATF director on a narrow 54-46 vote. That is not a coincidence of scheduling, that is a coordinated rollout, timed to land the moment the new director had the authority to sign it. Predictably, not everyone is applauding. Gun reform advocacy groups have raised real concerns about specific pieces of this package, particularly how loosened paperwork enforcement and streamlined dealer requirements could, in their view, make it easier for sellers to move firearms without the same level of background check scrutiny that existed. Before, the president of one prominent gun reform organization described these changes as primarily benefiting firearms industry, executives and political donors rather than everyday gun owners. A sharply different read on the exact same set of facts offered by industry representatives standing at that same podium. And here's a question worth sitting with. Regardless of where you land on gun policy generally, when an agency announces it is deprioritizing enforcement of immaterial paperwork errors, who decides what counts as immaterial? How much room does that judgment call leave for something more serious to slip through unnoticed until it is too late? That is not a rhetorical gotcha designed to score points. That is a genuinely open operational question, and it is going to be tested in the real world the moment these rules actually take effect. Here's where the story stops being a simple tale of federal deregulation and becomes something far more interesting, because at the exact same moment, Washington is loosening its grip, a growing number of individual states are slamming on the brakes and moving hard in the opposite direction, some on the very same calendar. Virginia is the clearest example, with a new governor and full Democratic control of state government. Virginia lawmakers pushed through roughly 24 gun-related bills in a single legislative session, one of the most sweeping packages the Commonwealth has seen in years. The headline measures include a ban on the future sale, manufacture, and transfer of firearms, defined under the new law as assault weapons, along with a ban on magazines holding more than 15 rounds, both taking effect July 1, 2026. Current owners are grandfathered in. They keep what they already legally own, but the law targets everything moving forward. Virginia also moved to restrict unserialized so-called ghost guns, expand the list of locations where firearms are prohibited even for permit holders, and expand civil liability exposure for gun manufacturers and dealers. And Virginia is far from alone. Massachusetts is rolling out a mandatory electronic gun registration portal with full compliance required by the end of October 2026. California enacted new laws extending firearm relinquishment requirements for certain prohibited minors and tightening security standards for licensed dealers. Colorado raised the minimum age to purchase ammunition to 21 and added identity verification at the point of sale. Rhode Island moved to ban the sale of an entire defined class of semi-automatic firearms outright. So here's the real headline hiding underneath the simpler one being sold to you. This is not one story about federal deregulation. This is a story about the federal government and a growing number of individual states pulling in genuinely opposite directions on gun policy at the exact same time, creating a patchwork where what is legal, what is taxed, and what is required can look completely different depending entirely on which state line you happen to be standing on. If you legally own a suppressor with zero federal tax stamp requirement, does that protect you the second you cross into a state that regulates that same item far more strictly? The honest answer, based on everything we just walked through, is no, not automatically. And untangling exactly where federal protection ends and state authority begins is going to keep courts, lawyers, and everyday gun owners busy for years. So what does all of this actually mean for you, whether you own a firearm, sell one, or have never touched one in your life? For gun owners, the near-term impact centers mostly on cost and paperwork friction rather than any fundamental expansion of what is legal to own. The tax stamp elimination is real money staying in people's pockets, and the proposed changes around interstate travel and spousal registration genuinely simplify processes gun owners have complained about for years. But the background check requirements, the actual mechanism determining who is legally allowed to buy a firearm in the first place, remain fully intact at the federal level and in a growing number of states. Additional layers of restriction are expanding, not shrinking, at the exact same time. For dealers, stepping back from aggressive enforcement of minor paperwork violations is a genuine reduction in existential business risk, something industry groups fought for aggressively for years. but it also shifts more responsibility onto dealers themselves to understand exactly where the line between an immaterial mistake and a serious violation actually sits, since that line is now drawn by agency discretion rather than a hard, uniform enforcement standard applied the same way in every case, every time. It is also worth being honest about how much of this package is genuinely new policy versus formalizing things that were already happening informally or reversing rules courts had already struck down. Outside analysts reviewing the announcement noted that much of it focuses on reducing paperwork, codifying practices ATF was already allowing case by case, or removing rules already blocked in litigation. That does not make the package meaningless, formalizing informal, inconsistent field discretion into codified regulation genuinely changes how predictably these rules get applied nationwide. But the full practical impact only becomes clear once complete rule text is published and dealers, lawyers, and gun owners actually start operating under it day to day. And here is the part. Regulatory policy in this space has proven again and again over the past decade. It swings like a pendulum. Enforcement tightens under one administration, loosens under the next, tightens again after that. Whether these particular reforms get formally codified into permanent, published rule text or remain discretionary policy, the future administration could simply reverse with a new director and new priorities is still an open question. Even a package being called the most significant regulatory reform in the agency's history is not permanent just because it was announced with fanfare and a room full of supportive industry representatives. So where does that leave us? On one side, a federal agency describing its own actions as historic modernization, cutting costs, reducing paperwork friction, and refocusing enforcement on cases that actually threaten public safety instead of clerical mistakes. On the other side, gun reform advocates warning that loosened enforcement creates real gaps bad actors could exploit, while a growing list of individual states actively tighten restrictions on the exact same category of firearms the federal government just made easier and cheaper to own. Both of those things are true at the same time, and that tension is not a glitch in how American federalism operates. It is arguably the system working exactly as designed, with different levels of government reflecting genuinely different political majorities and genuinely different views on where individual rights end and public safety begins. What do you think? Does federal deregulation, paired with state-level tightening, look like the system finding a reasonable balance? Or does it look like a country genuinely split down the middle on an issue it cannot resolve at any single level of government? Tell me where you land in the comments, because I want to actually hear it, not just guess at it. If this video gave you the real story, instead of just adding to the noise, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are done being talked at instead of talked to. And if you are not subscribed yet, fix that and turn on notifications, because with an issue this volatile, there is always a next chapter. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.